This is Piedmont and Tuscany 101. The format for today is a little different. Normally I would be pouring the whites right now for you guys, and then we'll do the reds later on. We're gonna do the reds right off the bat. But just as a little context of where we are today, for those of you who don't know where Piedmont or Tuscany are, we're kind of in northern and central Italy respectively. And the idea here is really to start highlighting some of the differences regionality-wise, while also talking a bit about the history of each of these places, because I think when it comes to Italy and France specifically, as we started to see with Burgundy and Bordeaux, history really affects the establishment of wine law and growing practices in each place, which I think is something that is really fun and fascinating, and it also makes wine go a hell of a lot deeper than just what's in your glass. So I think that context is really fun. Kicking off in your glass right now is a Nebbiolo coming from Barolo. It's Michele Carlo. It's a fun vintage. It's just getting kind of to that aged side of Nebbiolo, which I think starts to demonstrate the grape a little more purely than its kind of more harsh characteristics. The second wine here is coming from Brunello. It's Sangiovese, naturally. Il Palazzone. This is a Riserva coming from 2019, and I'm going to talk about what that means in a little while in terms of aging requirements when bottles like this can be released. Because while France might have some very strict regulations around growing practices, the Italians have more strict regulations around aging requirements before the wines hit the market. And we're going to talk a little bit about why that is, but for right now, what I kind of am hoping we do is just like take a sip, give a bit of a side-by-side for these two wines, 6 and 8 years respectively on these wines. And let's just talk about where these wines are at right now before we dive into each of the relative regions. What do we get on the Nebbiolo? What do you guys think immediately? Higher acidity, I would agree. Totally agree. Do we think the structure of the Nebbiolo is a little more aggressive versus the Sangiovese? So the point that I'm trying to make here is not just to talk about grape variety and everything like that, but with these two wines today, for us, it's a really special opportunity to start seeing what age can do to Nebbiolo. For me, I think that the Nebbiolo itself, I think the tannin structure is really, really tight, to your point, very fine, but super well integrated. It's still ripping in my palate. The tannin quality is really, really grippy for me. And I wanted to put these two wines side by side because then you go to the Brunello, and for me, this Sangiovese is expressing itself in like a much more floral, herbaceous, kind of red fruited way. But the acid's certainly higher on the Sangiovese. You notice like your palate when you sip the Sangiovese, you're salivating a hell of a lot more. Which is the indicator on your palate for higher acid. The texture in your mouth, though, is a hell of a lot softer for me on the Sangiovese. And I think that's the demonstration not just of oak integration, but of tannin quality on these grapes. The Nebbiolo is ripping still for me tannin-wise. So diving into Piedmont here and to kind of give it a little more structure, Piedmont's a weird region, right? Think about where we are. We're in the northwest of Italy. It's this land that has been disputed between the French, the Swiss to some extent, but and the Italians naturally. Romans have been traveling through this region historically, and that's naturally what gave wine its birth there. But it wasn't really until the 19th century that the that Nebbiolo seriously started to become the grape of the region. In Piedmont, we're going to talk about this in one slide. There are so many grapes; it's so abundant, and that's pretty true for Italy writ large. Every region has an onslaught of grape varieties that are grown, but more often than not, it is just one grape variety that reigns supreme in that region. And it wasn't until the 19th century with producers like Cavour and Marchesi di Barolo that Nebbiolo really started to be like the shining grape of the region. And in that way, it kind of modernized this idea of like the communes that we have today that we associate with Nebbiolo, that is Barolo and Barbaresco. We're going to talk about those two regions in a minute. But the really kind of take-home idea here is that bullet point there about tradition and family, insofar as this being kind of an extension of what we talked about with Burgundy, insofar as it's small growers, it's generationally passed down, but it doesn't have that same Napoleonic code that we saw with Burgundy, and therefore things don't get divided. And in that way, these houses have been around for a heck of a long time, and they have the same exact vineyard holdings generation after generation. It really establishes kind of structure, identity, longevity, and an identity of a producer rather than a vineyard site, even though there are certainly single vineyard expressions. When I talk about strategic geographical influences here, we're really talking about two major things, and that is the River Po, which is the river that runs through the region, one of the largest, if not the largest and longest river in Italy, coming down from the Alps and kind of closer down towards Milan, but traveling through Turin and Piedmont here. And the Alps, that is the name of Piedmont, it's Piemonte, foot of the Alps. Piedi, which is feet, Monte, Alps, mountains. And these are kind of the two geographical factors that really established this area for its identity in wine. That's to say, off of the river itself, you're getting a ton of light reflection. And with light reflection, you get UV exposure, but you're also already at higher altitude as you're creeping into the mountains. So that UV exposure, that higher light, really affects the ripening here. But it's also a little cold. We're in the mountains, right? And so with that, you get a much longer growing season, which is really beneficial for a grape like Nebbiolo for some reasons we'll talk about in a minute. Last but not least, it's wicked dry here. We're not near the ocean, right? And for that reason, you have these really dry growing conditions. It's not wet, it's not super dense, and for that reason, a lot of the wines that you find from this area are not just high acidity because of where we are in terms of altitude, but because there's not that water concentration that's really going to create that dense identity of a wine that we might have seen in Bordeaux, for example. I think that's an important consideration, especially when thinking about like latitude. Latitudinally, Bordeaux or longitudinally, Bordeaux and Piedmont are literally on the same degree, which is interesting to me. And in this case, with all of this said, I think when we're talking about Bordeaux or Piemonte specifically, it's a different approach, right? We're not talking about soil as much. We're not talking about the difference of how gravel soils are going to affect Cabernet Sauvignon against clay soils. We're really talking about microclimate here. We're talking about the ambient effects of where the vineyard is, altitudinally, whether or not it's protected, is it closer to the river, more UV exposure, is it a little higher up in elevation? These are the smaller considerations that you're thinking about in Piedmont, not necessarily just like the soil is different here than it is elsewhere. Important things to consider, especially in conjunction with Tuscany, which we'll talk about in a second. These are like the majority of the like common grapes you're going to find in Piedmont. And notice how abundant it is. We're talking about like close to 10 grapes that are grown pretty widely. There are a lot more than this. You have a lot of Chardonnay from up there, Sauvignon Blanc, some other indigenous grape varieties are grown pretty widely. And the funny thing here is that none of these grape varieties are incestual like we saw in France, right? In Piedmont, or in Bordeaux, it was everything coming down from Sauvignon Blanc and Cabernet Franc, whereas in Bordeaux or Burgundy, it was Gouais Blanc and Pinot Noir, and everything comes from that. Here in Piedmont, everything is its own identity. It's its own grape variety. It is super, super diverse in that way. And therefore there's no co-breeding, and every single one of these grape varieties expresses itself very, very differently. Nebbiolo is this incredibly highly tannic grape variety, as we know, and it generally gives off this very floral kind of tarred aroma, maybe a little bit of anise, and with that, the acidity is generally considered quite high for these wines. Why is that the case? Think about where we are. We're high altitude. High altitude is high acidity. It's always going to be the case because of that prolonged growing season. The sugars don't ripen as quickly. And that's kind of a through line for a lot of the grape varieties you're going to see in Piedmont. Some exceptions, but we'll talk about why that could be the case in a minute. Jumping next to Barbera, which is, I would say, like the second most widely grown red grape variety that you see up there. And this is like a much more darker, concentrated, not as light or finessed and tannic-driven wine as much as Nebbiolo, but Barbera is like this juicy, kind of bursting with dark fruits. It's generally a wicked food-friendly wine, and in that way it's actually oftentimes used in food pairings, or wine pairings rather, because it just is very food-friendly. Next is Dolcetto, a grape variety I love. It means literally the little sweet one. Dolce is sweet, and Etto is the local kind of pet name for something that's small. In most of Italy, it's Eno, but up here in Piedmont, it's Etto. But the little sweet one, and this was the exception that I was talking about a minute ago. The grape variety of Dolcetto is this really sweet grape. It's really high in sugar, and therefore, when it does start ripening, it is dominated by the fruit characteristic of these grapes. So you're showing more like violets, blackberries. It's softer tannins, lower acidity, which is really helpful, and that's pretty much because Dolcetto is grown a little farther down in the hills as you're kind of going towards the Mediterranean, closer to Liguria. And this makes for a wine that's more rounder and immediately approachable against something like Nebbiolo. Two other red grapes I wanted to include here that are grown pretty widely are Fresa and Ruché. Fresa, it's this rustic, tangy expression, very herbaceous red grape, grippier tannins, so kind of similar to Nebbiolo, but Ruché, on the other hand, is like, the first time I had a Ruché, it like blew me out of the water. I didn't expect it to be what it was, considering what I knew about the region. It's super perfumed, but it's also really, really, really spicy. It's also got that kind of through line of Piedmont, which is the medium-bodied, and it's just a lot more savory for a very light red wine, which for me is something that I didn't really think was going to be the case, considering the floral identity of Nebbiolo, that kind of concentration of Barbera, the sweetness you find with Dolcetto. I didn't think it would be, I thought it would kind of follow that through line, but Ruché does not, which I think is really fun. Moscato Bianco is oftentimes seen in a couple of ways, but primarily as kind of this sweeter, maybe a little effervescent or sparkly expression of a wine. It's honeyed, it's light, it's effervescent, it's sweet. Next is a grape variety that I love. I think it's my favorite Italian white grape variety, and that's, well, there's one other one that I'm going to talk about later, but that's Timorasso. Timorasso is a white grape that is like the go-to pairing for a roasted chicken for me. It's really complex. It's textural. It's kind of herbaceous insofar as thinking about like chamomile tea and kind of that roundness, honeyed, but kind of fuller bodied white wine that I really love. Next to that is Arnese, which is probably the more abundant of the white grape varieties that we see growing in Piedmont. It's also going to be the white grape variety I pour next week. It's this racing acidity wine, and it's generally mineral driven. The acidity doesn't come across as super racy, even though it is. It comes across as quite gentle, but that's because the grape is quite balanced. And insofar as its ripeness, it's very fresh and just phenolically, we talked about in that viticulture class. It's a grape variety that grows very gently rather than intensely. Last but not least is Cortese. It's the citrusy, lemony wine, and it definitely captures that salinity. It's typically grown down in the Langhe, which you'll see in a second, actually, which is just down about here, where things start to get closer to La Spezia. Down here would be the Mediterranean. La Spezia would be this little sliver of land here. So you're starting to get the creeping influence of the sea there, which definitely affects the Ardennes. So we're talking about a handful of regions here. We're talking about the Langhe writ large, which is this green area. You can find some really solid wines from the Langhe. It's the heart of Piedmont, even though it surrounds Piedmont. It is just like this area where you're going to find Nebbiolo, you're going to find Dolcetto, you're going to find everything grown in this area. And it's typically driven by a limestone and clay soil. But you're going to see that that kind of is the recurring theme, and why soil isn't really the focus here. Barolo, it's the same thing. It's the king of Piedmont, but it's because it's super, super powerful. And I often like to compare Barolo and Barbaresco as very feminine versus masculine expressions of Nebbiolo. If Barolo is the king, Barbaresco is the queen in that way. It's a much more feminine expression of Nebbiolo. It's aromatic and softer in Barbaresco, whereas Barolo is this like racingly aggressive expression of Nebbiolo. The 17, yes, it has a bit of age, which softens it out, but the tannin structure for me is so racing, whereas in Barbaresco, it's this much softer, more integrated expression of Nebbiolo. A little more easier to approach. Monferrato is worth talking about insofar as Barbera, because Asti is the heart of Monferrato. So we're thinking about this area that's going to be right in and around here. And Monferrato, for me, generally gives it that kind of more concentrated expression of a regionality, but that's why Barbera grows very well there, as opposed to the microclimate that you're going to find in Barolo and Barbaresco, a little higher in altitude, because it starts up and then goes down just as you're creeping up into the mountains. Here you also are going to find a lot of Ruché and Moscato being grown. It's very approachable wine. Whereas Asti, it's aromatic. It's known for Moscato d'Asti. You also can see Barbera d'Asti as well, pretty grown widely there. It's pretty fresh and charming in a lot of ways. Roero is a region that is worth mentioning. It's not seen super frequently, but Roero is mentionable for one reason and one reason only, and that's because that's where a lot of Ardennes is grown. It's well known for some more approachable Nebbiolo that's grown in the region, but it's a little sandier insofar as the tannin quality when you're talking about Nebbiolo that's grown right there. Alto Piemonte, that's a beast, and that's because Nebbiolo itself is a very aggressive grape. It's highly tannic, it's highly acidic, and when you're getting into these higher, cooler climates, this is where it starts to get intense for the growing conditions, which makes an already aggressive grape even more aggressive. Some pretty well-known sites are up in the Alto Piemonte, one of which is Gattinara, which we see Conterno making every now and then. Gemme and Bocca are also up there, if you know those vineyard sites. Interestingly, this is where Nebbiolo starts to change a tiny bit insofar as how it's understood. Because the growing conditions are so different up there, Nebbiolo isn't even called Nebbiolo anymore. It's called Spanna up there, S-P-A-N-N-A. That's the not clonal variety, but just the local dialect to refer to Nebbiolo. It's this a little more tense, lighter expression of Nebbiolo, but it's also like mineral driven because of that higher altitude and cooler climate. Last but not least is, and necessarily, talking about Gabbi. Gabbi is where you see Cortese being grown, and it's just this quite mineral, salty area. I wanted to finish up talking about Piedmont by way of talking about some of the classifications in this area. There's Vino da Tavola, which is just like your table wine. It's basic everyday wine. It's rarely exported for a reason, and strangely enough, when Americans go to Europe, these are the wines that they love because they're, number one, delicious, but they're also wicked cheap. They're never exported into America, though. There are producers making these wines, and it's not worth it for them. The juice isn't worth the squeeze, as it were. IGT, this is going to come up more heavily in Tuscany, but IGT wines, they're less common than DOC and DOCG, but this is where government regulations and growing conditions start to come up a lot more for Italy. And it's kind of, I like to consider IGT kind of the experimental land. This is where a lot of producers are making different cuvées of wines that they might want to put up for DOP. Anyway, they're less common at any rate. Moving on to the DOC, which is Denominazione di Origine Controllata, it covers the majority of Piedmont for the most part. It's regulated for grape varieties, so not every grape variety can fall within DOC categories. Like, for example, Barbera d'Asti, Dolcetto, these fall within DOC, but then you go to DOCG and it can't be Barbera, it can't be Dolcetto. They need to fulfill the DOCG, which is Denominazione Origine Controllata e Garantita, which only really applies to Barolo and Barbaresco. Strangely enough, the Italians decided that Gabbi deserves to fall into that place, and there is one area within Barbera that does fall within that category. It's, strangely enough, the highest concentration of DOCG vineyard sites and geographic locations in Italy. It kind of underlines kind of the uniqueness of all of the vineyard sites that you find within Piedmont. Last but not least is a necessary addition here, which is the word sori. Sori translates in local slang to sunny. It's typically given to the most south-facing sunny sites in Piedmont, and it's considered kind of these more Grand Cru equivalent vineyard sites. That's to say, this is like the most prized area, and it's important because we're going to think back to the grape variety of Nebbiolo. It's aggressive. It's really, really tough to approach. But if you're going to get more UV exposure, if you're going to get a sunnier site, you're going to be able to find that phenolic ripeness in the growing season, which really, really gives this great richness and balance to Barolos and Barbarescas explicitly. There's one producer who is like famed for this, which is Gaia, exactly. So Gaia is known to have the famous Sori labels. There's San Lorenzo, there's Sori Taldin, and these are just like these exceptionally warm and steep sites. They're well exposed, and it's not really typically used as like a traditional government regulation as much as it is like a prestige thing that you throw on the label. So now we're going to go to a region that has a lot more cultural and historical influence insofar as its birth of as a region. Because Piedmont is this place that's switched hands over and over and over, there isn't a ton to really say insofar as the history is concerned in influencing the area. But when it comes to Tuscany, it sure matters. We're talking about an area that was dominated by the Etruscans, so 3,000 years ago, predating the Romans, there was a group of people called the Etruscans, which is where we get the name naturally of Tuscany, Toscana, Etrusca. kind of that one-to-one there. It's this group of people that really gave birth to what we know to be the case in the Roman times, thinking of like old Roman towns that were built in kind of a square format that really was born from the Etruscans taking the city of Florence, for example, as a great example. The city of Florence was typically known to be a Roman city. There's a city just above Florence called Fiesole that is known to be an Etruscan city. And in other words, the Romans decided to build their land on the river floor, like close to a river because of accessibility for moving, whereas the Etruscans wanted to be close to a river but overlooking it for defense reasons, right? Because they could see around themselves. And in that way, typically, you don't see a lot of grape growing regions in Tuscany close to a river. You see them high up on the towns where the Etruscans were. And that's because the Etruscans started growing up there, and the Romans decided that the wine grown on the hills were better than the wines grown by the rivers. And in that, we kind of skip over the Roman time and we move right to medieval influences. At this point, religion started to dominate this area because thinking about Piedmont, it was always changing hands, but it was predominantly the Romans, so Catholicism was pretty central there. When it comes to the Middle Ages and the kind of centrality that Florence offered itself as a religious capital, you also started to get the influence of monasteries, you started to get the influence of nobility, and when that starts to happen, you start to get families that buy land writ large in the region. And when you think about this as it trickles across the region, it lays the groundwork for a lot of the wines that we know today. Thinking about the wines that we were selling a couple weeks ago, the Ricasoli wines. Those Ricasoli wines, that's a noble family that's been around Florence since the 1200s, since the medieval times. It's established here. Now, I added an addendum here about a black rooster, and that's a historical story that I really love. And it does matter quite significantly for why Chianti is known as Chianti today. In this time, thinking about like the 1200s, 1300s, there were two political sects of the Guelphs and the Ghibellines. It was like those for the Holy Roman Empire on the Ghibelline side, and the Guelphs were for those with the papacy. And the city of Siena was known to be a Ghibelline stronghold. And then once the Holy Roman Empire kind of started to fall behind, it started to become a political separation for the white Guelphs and the black Guelphs. And in Florence, it was an area very well known as being a black Guelph stronghold, whereas in Siena, it was a white Guelph stronghold. These were the political allegiances at the time against who should be the rightful pope. Why does this matter? Well, because in Florence and Siena, Florence is up here, Siena's down here, and in between there's Chianti. It's about 40 kilometers difference. And with that land being the prized wine area, the Florentines and the Sienese were like, who really should have political control of this area? So they decided to have a funny competition. For 1 month, do you know the story? No? For 1 month, they were like, okay, we're gonna raise a chicken. And whatever rooster can get from Florence to Siena or Siena to Florence first will have domination over the area. Now, the Sienese were like, okay, we're gonna take our white chicken, our white rooster, which is emblematic of white Guelphs, and we're going to feed the heck out of it, because if we feed the heck out of this chicken, it's going to wake up earlier and it's going to fly faster. It's going to be a faster chicken. The Florentines were like, no, we're not going to do that, because if you feed a chicken more, it's going to wake up later. It's not going to wake up earlier, and it's going to be heavier. So the Florentines decided to take their black chicken and to starve it. And so on the night of the flight, the Florentine chicken woke up 4 hours earlier and got to Siena, I think about 4 hours earlier than the white rooster. And for that reason, that's why there's a black rooster on the Chianti label, because Florence took control of the area. So that was kind of where things stayed. After the 1300s, it kind of stayed that way up until the 1900s, when government regulations started to be established. That same DOC structure, DOCG structure, started to become kind of the classic classifications for the area. And then it turned into, all right, what can we do with this area based off of what we see is going on in the wine world? And that's where Super Tuscans started to be born in about the 1900s. Super Tuscans were born by way of seeing how well Bordeaux was doing, and as the Bordelais started to travel more and more frequently around, so did the grape varieties. And they saw that the area pretty close to the coast in Tuscany, which is that western part that we know as Maremma, it's really great growing conditions for Bordelais grape varieties. And because of the government regulations, these were not Sangiovese grapes that are the grape that is kind of dominant in all of Tuscany, so it couldn't fall within the government regulations of DOC and DOCG. Instead, it fell within IGT, and it gave the identity of its own name, Super Tuscans. That kind of goes in tandem with that Mediterranean climate that we know as the identity for Tuscany. It's this area that is a little warmer, it's moderated by the seaside, and it's a little more continental as you go inland and as elevation grows closer towards the areas of Montalcino, which we know as the Brunello that's right in front of you. It's also a lot more diverse regionality-wise. Like I just said, we're close to the sea where we're growing these Bordelais. You see even Syrah being grown out there. And then you go over to more eastern Tuscany, and it becomes this much more soil-driven wine. In fact, as you get to Chianti, that's where things change completely, because it starts to become a soil-driven wine. There are two types of limestone specifically that are the identity factors for Tuscany and for Chianti wines. That is Galestro and Albarese. Galestro on the left here, Albarese on the right, and these are the wines that really, or the soils that really give Chianti its identity that we know today. That's to say that we're doing these weird mixes of clay and limestone here, but you can see that one that is the Albarese is a little more limestone driven. You can see those kind of cuts that limestone generally has, whereas the Albarese a little more concentrated in clay. That's why it's a little more compact. It's more frequently to be well drained because of how compact it gets. The limestone absorbs, strangely enough, more water here than the Galestro does, which is counterintuitive to what we think about when it comes to clay versus limestone-based soils. And in that way, for wines that are grown on Galestro, they're smaller. They're more concentrated, more powerful, more lifted expressions of Sangiovese. It's high-toned elegance, thinking about Brunello specifically. A lot of Galestro grown in Brunello. Whereas Albarese, when you see Rosso di Montalcino, for example, that is typically grown on Albarese. It's a little more harsh, structured, mineral, firm as an expression of a Sangiovese. It's a little more laser focused. Think about it like this, insofar as like Galestro is elegant, lifted, whereas Albarese is structured and powerful. In Tuscany, we have a lot more grapes than we know what to do with. This encompasses like another 5 grape varieties in itself. And then there are a bunch of other grape varieties that I intentionally left off because it just is so abundant. Sangiovese really reigns supreme here, as we know, thinking about Brunello, thinking about Chianti, it's all Sangiovese. In that, though, there are a couple of grape varieties that go in tandem with that Sangiovese. Sangiovese kind of being that kind of earthen, herbaceous, firm acidity, savory expression of a red grape. It's often blended, though, with 2 grape varieties, that is Canaiolo and Colorino. Canaiolo, seldom seen on its own. It's a little more floral and lifted, and it kind of gives this roundness to specifically those Albarese-based Sangioveses, whereas Colorino is used for a deep color. And so it's used as a blending grape for those Galestro-based Sangioveses. It's kind of funny though, because Colorino you do see every now and then as a table wine in the area, just because it is fruity, it's dark, it's very approachable. I'm not going to go into all of the Bordelais because we spoke about that in the Bordeaux class, so I just don't, at the sake of not wanting to be particularly redundant, but I will say the predominant Bordelais that are grown here in the areas closer towards the coast would be Cabernet Sauvignon necessarily, Cabernet Franc, and Merlot. When talking about white grape varieties, though, there are really three that reign supreme, and that's Trebbiano Toscano, that's Vernaccia, and Vermentino. Trebbiano Toscano, historic white grape variety of the region. It's crisp, it's subtle, it's citrusy. It's often used too, not just for a white wine, but also for a sweet wine that we know as Vinsanto. Next is a grape variety that I love and adore of my Italian whites. It's number one or number two, that's Vernaccia. It's native to a town called San Gimignano, which I'll show you on a map in a moment. It's known for this really almond-based identity. It's saline, it's crisp, but it's also so refreshing. It is also historically known to be Michelangelo Buonarroti's favorite grape variety. Next to that is Vermentino, last but not least. It's typically grown on the coast, so you're getting a lot more of that saline, aromatic, lively expression of white grape variety here. It's definitely backed up by a slight herbaceousness there too, but really taking into that sea climate. So just talking about the general regions here in Tuscany, a little more approachable, fortunately, because it's a little more diluted, even though the map might not show as much. But we're really talking about, all right, we're in this area let's start with Florence here. Siena's down here. This is that debated area that I mentioned before. And Chianti Classico, where you see these sites that you were mentioning. There are a handful of other very well-known towns in there as well. This is all Sangiovese in the gray and purple, and as you get out here and kind of come down, it's all Sangiovese around here. So it really does take up the majority of what is grown in Tuscany by far and large. But then you find other sites like Brunello di Montalcino, you have Montepulciano. This is where you're seeing very different expressions of Sangiovese, so much so that it merits a different DOCG and different aging requirements, which I'll talk about in a second. Sangiovese kind of moves down to the south, closer to Montalcino. You also get different clonal expressions of Sangiovese that start to change, which is why oftentimes in Montalcino, you're going to hear it called Sangiovese Grosso. Even though it is Sangiovese, it is a type of Sangiovese that has these very large berries. Remember I mentioned a minute ago that Galestro-based soils have these tiny berries. Albarese soils, which you see pretty dominantly in Montalcino, bigger berries. And for that reason, the clone of Sangiovese has acclimated itself to just naturally grow larger berries, which is why Sangiovese Grosso, fat Sangiovese. Montepulciano, it's another expression of Sangiovese, but a little softer, more approachable red wine. Bolgheri is an area that I love and adore. You see a lot of Super Tuscans grown here, but they're polished in their character. They're full of tension because they're influenced a little bit by the sea, but it's a tiny bit inland as we look for Bolgheri. We're kind of in this area right here. And when you're thinking about, proximity to sea, if you're thinking about like Bordeaux and the Médoc, it's right against the water. Bolgheri is a little tucked more inland, so it's really leaning into the soil more than it is the sea influence, even though the sea influence does take its form. That area in the pink is Maremma. It's a broad, sun-dressed coastal area that does grow quite a bit of Sangiovese, but it also does grow those Bordelais, primarily Cabernet. It also grows quite a large amount of Syrah as well, which I think is interesting. The Rhone grape varieties have a different history about how they arrived to Tuscany, but that's another story for another time. two honorable mentions here are these last two. It's Carmignano, and which you can see there on the map in Vernaccia. Carmignano is one of the oldest DOCs in Tuscany. It's known, strangely enough, not for just doing a Bordelais blend or a Sangiovese blend, but a mix of the two. And for that reason, you find kind of this like weird history of blends in this area, the predominant concentration of Super Tuscan producers in this area as well. Last but not least is Vernaccia di San Gimignano, the oldest DOC in wine growing region in all of Italy. It was the first established, I think, back in 1384 or 48. I can't remember, dyslexia. But it's known for one reason and one reason only, in that town they only grow Vernaccia. It is the only grape variety allowed. So if you ever see wine from San Gimignano, it's going to be a white wine with Vernaccia as the grape variety. Fossil-rich soils there too. It starts to get a little more complicated as you get closer towards central Italy, but that's a story for another time because we're not talking about Umbria today. Last but not least, we're gonna talk a little bit about these DOC and IGT establishments. And it primarily has to do with Super Tuscans. So I've mentioned Vino da Tavola, I've mentioned the DOC rules. We're really going to talk about this IGT thing though right now because it really applies mostly to Super Tuscans. Once Bordelais established themselves on the coast in Tuscany, they started to be grown in so much abundance that they needed to establish a new government regulation. And it wasn't until 1992, that the IGT regulation or classification was established. And that's just because so many producers were growing these Bordeaux blends in Tuscany, and they didn't know what the heck to do with them gubernatorially. They didn't know how to regulate and what to slap on the label, because it didn't help growers to not have the government backing them up to say, okay, this is an established product, because otherwise it would have just been this thing that they were making and you just had to have a brand. It helped nonetheless, because after the mid-90s, the IGT program really started to push Super Tuscan blends, and that's necessarily because they had government backing. We're thinking about places like Sassicaia, Tignanello, and Ornellaia. A lot of these places, strangely enough though, had a brand to back them up, which is what helped push the government to back them up with money. I want to take a minute to talk about a couple standout DOCs and DOCG. The only DOC I want to really mention is Bulgari. It's all a DOC within that area. And for it to fall within Bulgari DOC, there are a handful of grape varieties that can fulfill that. It's not like Piedmont in that way. In that way, it's often Vernaccia, or not Vernaccia, Vermentino and Sangiovese when talking about Bulgari DOC. But if you see a Bulgari IGT, oftentimes we'll have Cabernet Franc blended into that as well. DOCGs worth mentioning, Chianti Classico and Brunello di Montalcino. But Brunello di Montalcino is a beast, and it has a label of an exception for me because of aging requirements. In most of these regions in Tuscany, the aging requirements for a DOC or a DOCG are minimal and not really invasive to the wine producer. But when it comes to Brunello, things get really, really difficult, as the Italians are, as someone who used to live there for 6 years, they're wont to do that every now and then. And so if we're talking about Brunello DOC, or DOCG, excuse me, you have to have a minimum of 5 years of aging. 2 years have to be in oak, 4 months have to be in bottle, but it has to be somewhere in between there for 5 years to be aged. But there is something in front of you today that is a pleasure to be drinking, and that is Brunello Reserva. It means that it has to have, it's also the most strict and longest aging requirement in all of the world. 6 years of total aging, 2 have to be in oak and 6 have to be in bottle, but again, the measurements can be anywhere in between before it's released. And for that reason, to your point earlier, that's why the Sangiovese comes across as quite soft, subtle, and well-rounded, because of the Reserva quality on a vintage that is 19, very soft and minimally invasive vintage. Wasn't harsh growing conditions until the very end, when it got really ripe and things just had to be picked. These generally have a huge amount of structure. They're very age-worthy, and they're oftentimes the most noble or kind of classic expressions of Brunello di Montalcino. And similarly to what I just mentioned about the IGT structure, necessarily Super Tuscans have to follow suit insofar as it really being the impetus for establishing the IGT program. Like I said before, the 90s, it had to be labeled as table wine, and that just didn't help the growers. So it is an exception in and of itself. After all of this, I kind of wanted to open it up to all of us. We all are familiar, we're a little more savvy and more adept with these wines, but I have a slew of conversation topics here to kind of get folks who are at this class in the future, that is next week, to talk with me about what they're kind of taking away between these two regions. And that's that.